May 1969, Honolulu, President Richard Nixon sat across from Australian generals who had just claimed their nation won the Pacific War, and what he said next would shatter decades of carefully constructed myths with nothing but cold, hard numbers. The room fell silent as Nixon pulled out a folder containing casualty reports, supply records, and battle logs that told a very different story than the one these decorated officers had been selling to the world. But here's what everyone wants to know. When allies who fought beside you start rewriting history to steal your victory, how do you tell them the truth without destroying the friendship? The air inside the Pacific Command conference room hung thick and hot despite the whirring air conditioners mounted in the windows. President Richard Nixon loosened his tie and looked across the polished wood table at three Australian generals in crisp dress uniforms, their chests covered in medals that caught the overhead lights. These men had traveled 6,000 miles to attend a military planning conference, but they had brought something else with them. They had brought a story, and that story was about to cause a problem that no amount of diplomacy could smooth over. The problem had been growing for years, quietly, like rust on iron. Ever since World War II ended in 1945, something strange had been happening in history books. Australian accounts of the Pacific War were changing. The story was shifting. What started as proud remembrance of their brave soldiers had slowly transformed into something else entirely. By 1969, Australian military publications were saying things that made American veterans shake their heads in disbelief. They were claiming that Australia had played an equal role in defeating Japan. Some were going even further. They were saying that Australian forces had been the main reason Japan was stopped. Nixon knew the real numbers. He had served in the Pacific himself during the war. He had been a Navy officer stationed in the South Pacific, loading supplies and watching young American men board ships heading toward islands with names most people back home could not pronounce. He remembered the casualty lists. He remembered the ships that came back with fewer men than they left with. More than 100,000 Americans had died fighting Japan across the Pacific Ocean. The United States had spent billions of dollars, built thousands of ships and planes, and sent nearly 2 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen to fight in that vast theater of war. But now, sitting in this conference room in Hawaii, Nixon was hearing a very different version of events. Air Marshal Peter Williams, a decorated Australian officer with silver hair and a stern face, stood at the head of the table. He pointed to a map of the Pacific showing the battle zones from 1942 to 1945. His voice was confident, almost casual, as he described how Australian intelligence had been the key to victory. He talked about the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 as if it had been primarily an Australian operation. He spoke of General Douglas MacArthur's island hopping campaign as though Australian forces had led the charge on every beach. Nixon felt his jaw tighten. He glanced at Admiral John McCain Sr., who sat 2 seats down from him. McCain had commanded aircraft carriers in the Pacific. He had been there. His weather-beaten face showed no emotion, but his fingers drummed slowly on the table, a sure sign that he was holding back words he wanted to say. The other Australian officers nodded along as Williams spoke. They seemed to genuinely believe what they were saying. That was what made this so difficult. These were not liars. These were men who had served their country and fought bravely. But somewhere along the way, the story had gotten twisted. It had been stretched and reshaped until it no longer matched what had actually happened. Williams continued his presentation. He claimed that Australian ground forces had been critical in every major campaign. He suggested that American commanders had relied heavily on Australian strategic planning. He said the word partnership over and over, but the way he said it made it sound like Australia had been the senior partner. Nixon had come to this conference hoping to discuss future defense cooperation. He wanted to talk about the present and the future, but instead, he was being forced to confront the past. He knew what was at stake here. Australia was an important ally. The United States needed friends in the Pacific, especially with the Vietnam War still raging. Offending the Australians could damage a relationship that mattered for national security. But Nixon also knew something else. He knew that lying to your friends, even polite lying, was no way to build trust. And this version of history that the Australian generals were presenting was not just wrong. It was so wrong that staying silent would be its own kind of lie. The conventional wisdom said he should smile, nod, and let it go. Diplomats had been doing exactly that for 20 years. Every time an Australian official made grand claims about their role in the Pacific War, American officials would quietly change the subject. It was easier that way. It avoided confrontation. It kept everyone happy. But Nixon had never been very good at doing what was easy when he knew it was wrong. He thought about the American families who had received telegrams saying their sons would not be coming home. He thought about the ships at the bottom of the ocean and the airmen who had been shot down over jungles and never found. Those men deserved to have their story told correctly. Williams finished his presentation and sat down, looking pleased with himself. The room was quiet for a moment. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Someone coughed. Nixon could feel everyone waiting to see what he would say. The easy path was clear. Thank them for their contribution. Praise the alliance. Move on to other topics. Instead, Nixon leaned forward and spoke quietly. "That's an interesting perspective, Air Marshal," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "But I wonder if we might look at some numbers together." He opened a folder that his aide had placed in front of him before the meeting. Inside were papers, lots of papers, reports, logs, and statistics that his staff had pulled from military archives over the past week. The Australian generals exchanged glances. They had not expected this. Williams smiled uncertainly. "Of course, Mr. President," he said, "though I'm not sure numbers tell the whole story of war." Nixon looked up at him. "You're right," he said. "Numbers don't tell the whole story, but they do tell us who was where, who did what, and who paid the price." He paused, letting that sink in. "And I think we owe it to everyone who fought to get that part right." Admiral McCain leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that morning, a slight smile crossed his face. The room suddenly felt different. The comfortable atmosphere had vanished. Now there was tension, crackling like electricity before a storm. Nixon had just done something that diplomats spend their careers trying to avoid. He had challenged the comfortable story. He had said that maybe, just maybe, everyone needed to look at the truth, even if the truth was uncomfortable. The question hanging in the air was simple. What happens when someone finally says that the emperor has no clothes? What happens when years of polite fiction run headlong into documented fact? Nixon was about to find out, and so were the Australian generals sitting across from him. Nixon pulled the first document from his folder and slid it across the smooth table. The paper made a soft whisking sound against the polished wood. Air Marshal Williams picked it up and squinted at the typed numbers. It was a strength report from the Pacific Theater, dated December 1944. when the war against Japan was at its peak. At the height of the Pacific War, Nixon said, his voice steady and quiet, the United States had 1,770,000 service members deployed in the Pacific theater. He let that number sit in the air for a moment. Australia's maximum deployment throughout the entire war was 417,000. That's excellent for a nation of 7 million people. Your country punched well above its weight. But let's be clear about the scale we're discussing. Williams set the paper down carefully. His face had gone a shade paler. The other Australian officers shifted in their seats. Nixon was not done. He pulled out another sheet. This one had a list of battles typed in neat columns. The Battle of the Coral Sea, Nixon said, looking directly at Williams. You mentioned it was a major Australian victory. Let's look at what actually happened in May 1942. Nixon's finger traced down the page. 2 American aircraft carriers participated, the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown. Australia provided some cruisers and destroyers for support, and your land-based aircraft flew reconnaissance missions. Critical help, absolutely, but the Americans lost the Lexington. We lost 216 men when she went down. The pilots who stopped the Japanese carrier force were flying from American decks. One of the Australian officers, a younger general named Patterson, cleared his throat. With respect, Mr. President, our intelligence network provided the warnings that made the battle possible. Nixon nodded. Your intelligence helped, no question, but helping win a battle and winning a battle are different things. He pulled out yet another document. His staff had been thorough. Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943. That campaign broke the back of Japanese expansion in the South Pacific. 7,100 Americans died on that island. Your official records show 0 Australian ground troops at Guadalcanal because there were none there. The room had gone very quiet. The air conditioner hummed in the window. Outside, palm trees swayed in the Hawaiian breeze, but inside the tension was thick enough to cut. Williams opened his mouth to respond, but Nixon kept going. The island-hopping campaign that General MacArthur led from 1943 to 1945, Nixon said. The United States military conducted 41 major amphibious assaults. 38 of those were led and primarily executed by American forces. 3 involved significant Australian participation. He slid another paper across the table, showing the breakdown of each operation, complete with troop numbers and dates. Your soldiers fought bravely in New Guinea and Borneo. Nobody is taking that away from you. But leading the Pacific campaign, the numbers don't support that claim. Admiral McCain finally spoke up. His voice was rough, like gravel. Mr. President, if I may. Nixon nodded. McCain turned to the Australian officers. Gentlemen, I flew missions off carriers in the Pacific. I saw what happened out there. I respect what your men did, but I also kept logs, daily logs. He reached into his own briefcase and pulled out a worn notebook with a cracked leather cover. This is from the USS Wasp, 1944. Every single day I wrote down which squadrons flew, how many planes we lost, how many enemy aircraft we shot down. He opened to a random page. June 19th, 1944, Philippine Sea. We lost 29 aircraft, shot down 380 Japanese planes. Not one Australian pilot flew that day because you did not have carriers in that battle. William's face had gone from pale to red. Admiral, we are not trying to diminish American sacrifice. We are simply ensuring that Australia's contribution is recognized. Recognized as what? Nixon asked. The question was direct, almost harsh. Recognized as brave allies who helped the United States win the war? I will say that every day of the week. Recognized as the force that won the war? The evidence says otherwise. Nixon pulled out more papers. The pile kept growing. Supply records showing that the United States had provided 94% of all ammunition used in the Southwest Pacific. Production figures showing American factories had built the ships, planes, and tanks that equipped both American and Australian forces. Casualty reports from 24 major battles. Every single document pointed to the same conclusion. The United States had been the dominant force in the Pacific War by every measurable standard. Patterson, the younger Australian general, tried a different approach. Mr. President, perhaps raw numbers do not capture everything. Australia provided strategic bases. We gave you Darwin, Brisbane, and Sydney. Our geography was critical. Absolutely critical, Nixon agreed. And we paid rent. American dollars flowed into the Australian economy throughout the war. We built facilities and infrastructure that your country still uses today. It was a partnership, General. A partnership where one side provided most of the money, most of the men, and most of the machines. He leaned forward. Do you know how many aircraft the United States shot down in the Pacific? 14,533 Japanese planes. 87% were destroyed by American pilots. That's not a guess. That's from verified combat reports. Williams found his voice again. Intelligence, Mr. President. You keep focusing on combat, but wars are won with information. Australian code breakers and intelligence officers provided crucial data that guided strategy. Nixon had been expecting this. He pulled out a report marked with a red classified stamp that had been crossed out with a black marker. The document had been recently declassified. Your intelligence services contributed approximately 8% of the actionable intelligence used in the Pacific Theater. The United States provided 73%. British sources provided the remainder. Your 8% mattered. I am not saying it did not, but it was 8%, not 80%. The Australian officers sat in stunned silence. They had walked into this meeting expecting polite nods and general agreement. Instead, they were being confronted with document after document that contradicted the narrative they had been building for decades. Admiral McCain tapped his notebook on the table. Gentlemen, I have to ask, where did this version of events come from? I read Australian papers sometimes. I have seen the claims getting bigger each year. Who started saying that Australia won the Pacific War? Williams looked uncomfortable. We have never claimed we won it alone. We have said we were equal partners. Equal partners, Nixon repeated. He picked up a sheet showing comparative losses. The United States lost over 100,000 dead in the Pacific. Australia lost around 40,000 total across all theaters, including Europe and North Africa. In the Pacific specifically, you lost about 18,000. Every single one of those deaths was a tragedy. Every family that lost a son or father paid a price that cannot be measured. But equal partners? By what measure? Nixon sat back in his chair. His voice became quieter, almost gentle. Here is what I think happened. Your country fought hard. Your people were scared. Japan bombed Darwin. Japanese submarines entered Sydney Harbor. You faced a real threat of invasion. Your men and women did everything they could to stop that threat. And you should be proud of that. You should be very proud. But over time, the pride became something else. The story grew. And now we are in a place where the story and the truth have separated. Williams finally showed some anger. Mr. President, our veterans deserve recognition. They do, Nixon said firmly. They deserve accurate recognition based on what they actually did, not inflated claims that insult the memory of the Americans who died in those same battles. He tapped the stack of documents. These numbers are not opinions, they are facts. The United States Navy fought 23 major naval battles against Japan. Australia participated significantly in 2 of them. That is not an equal partnership. That is a junior partner providing valuable support. The meeting had reached a critical point. The Australian officers looked at each other, clearly unsure how to respond. Nixon had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had simply laid out the facts, one after another, until the weight of evidence could not be ignored. Admiral McCain watched carefully, his weathered face expressionless. He knew what Nixon was doing. This was not about winning an argument. This was about establishing truth. Real alliances could not be built on comfortable lies. They had to be built on shared understanding of what had actually happened. Nixon glanced at his notes one final time before the next phase. Someone needed to remind them, as he had told his aides before this meeting, who paid the bill and who did the dying. The silence in the conference room stretched out like a long shadow. Outside, seabirds called to each other over the harbor where American warships sat at anchor. Some of those ships were newer, built after the war, but a few were old veterans from the Pacific fighting, still wearing their scars under fresh coats of gray paint. Williams finally spoke, and his voice had changed. The confidence was gone. Mr. President, what exactly are you asking us to do? Nixon did not answer right away. He looked at each of the Australian officers, one by one, meeting their eyes. I am asking you to help me tell the truth, he said simply, because allies who cannot be honest with each other are not really allies at all. He pulled out one more document. This one was different from the others. It was not a battle report or a casualty list. It was a comparison of how the Pacific War was being described in different countries. American textbooks said the United States led the effort with help from allies. British books said much the same thing. But Australian publications from 1968 and 1969 were telling a different story entirely. Some school books in Australia were teaching children that their country had played an equal or even leading role in defeating Japan. Before and after, Nixon said, sliding the comparison across the table, before your historians started revising the narrative, the numbers were accepted. Now they are being disputed, not with evidence, but with wishful thinking. He pointed to a paragraph in an Australian military history from 1968. This book claims equal partnership in the Pacific victory. Based on what? Where are the numbers to support that? Patterson, the younger general, picked up the document and read it carefully. His face showed something that others did not show. He looked troubled, like a man realizing he had believed something that might not be true. I was taught this in staff college, he said quietly. They told us Australia had been a full equal in the Pacific campaign. Who told you that? Admiral McCain asked, not unkindly. The instructors, the textbooks, everyone. Patterson looked up. Are you saying it was all wrong? Nixon shook his head. Not all wrong. Australia fought. Australia contributed. But full equal? No. The evidence does not support it. He opened a leather-bound folder that contained official U.S. military reports from General MacArthur's headquarters. MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific area. Let's look at his operational reports from 1944. Nixon turned pages until he found what he was looking for. In the planning documents for the Philippines campaign, MacArthur lists his forces. 87% of the combat divisions were American, 13% were Australian or other allies. For air support, American squadrons outnumbered everyone else by 10-1. Williams tried one more defense. Air Marshal, our air crews provided critical reconnaissance, and our engineers built airfields throughout New Guinea. They did, Nixon agreed, and those contributions mattered, but reconnaissance and engineering support, while valuable, are not the same as bearing the main weight of combat operations. He picked up a photograph from his folder. It showed an American landing craft approaching a beach, packed with young soldiers. Explosions threw up columns of water around the boat. This is Peleliu, September 1944. 10,000 Americans stormed that island. Nearly 2,000 died taking it. 0 Australians participated because it was an American operation. He set down another photo. Iwo Jima, February 1945. 70,000 Americans landed. 7,000 died. 20,000 were wounded. Australia was not there. Another photo. Okinawa, April 1945. The biggest amphibious assault in the Pacific. 182,000 Americans, 12,000 Americans killed. Australia had no ground forces in that battle. The photos kept coming. Each one showed American Marines or soldiers fighting on beaches with names that had become famous. Tarawa, where the sand turned red with blood. Saipan, where Japanese defenders fought from caves until the bitter end. Each battle told the same story. Americans died by the thousands while Australian forces were fighting in different locations, usually in smaller operations. Nixon's voice grew softer as he looked at the photos. "I knew some of these men," he said. "Not personally, but I processed their supply requests when I was stationed in the Pacific. They would radio for ammunition, for food, for medical supplies. We would load it on planes or ships and send it out. Sometimes those men would be dead before the supplies arrived." He looked up at Williams. Those men deserved to have their story told correctly. They deserved to be remembered as the ones who won these battles, because they did win them with their blood. The mood in the room had shifted completely. The Australian officers were no longer defensive. They looked uncomfortable, yes, but also thoughtful. Patterson especially seemed shaken. He was younger than the others, probably in his late 40s. He might have been a child during the war, learning about it from books rather than experience. Now he was discovering that the books had lied. Admiral McCain pulled out his old notebook again. He flipped through pages, showing entries written in faded blue ink. January 15th, 1945, he read aloud. Escorted strike against Japanese shipping near Formosa. Lost 6 aircraft, 3 pilots recovered, 3 missing. Destroyed 1 enemy cruiser, probably sank another. Damaged 4 transports. He looked up. I wrote that entry sitting in my quarters on the carrier after the mission. Every carrier kept logs like this, say thousands and thousands of pages documenting every single operation. You can read them all. They are in the archives. And what they show over and over is American squadrons flying the missions, American ships in the gun lines, American troops on the beaches. Williams had been listening quietly. Now he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He suddenly looked very old and very tired. Operational realities, he said slowly. That is what you are talking about. The operational reality that America was bigger, richer, and fielded more forces. Yes, Nixon said. Exactly that. Operational realities. Australia did not have the population or industry to match the United States. That is not a criticism. That is just fact. A country of 7 million cannot field the same force as a country of 140 million. Nobody expected you to. Then why does it matter if our history books give us a bit more credit? Patterson asked. The question sounded genuine, not defensive. If it makes Australians proud of their service, what is the harm? Nixon leaned forward, his eyes intense. The harm is that pride built on false claims is hollow. The harm is that real accomplishments get lost when you inflate them into fantasies. The harm is that truth matters, General. It just matters. He tapped the table for emphasis. Australian soldiers fought bravely in terrible conditions. They held the line in New Guinea when it mattered most. They tied down Japanese forces and saved lives by their presence. That is the real story. That is the story worth telling. But when you claim equal partnership in the entire Pacific War, you are not honoring your veterans. You are insulting the memory of the American dead. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke for a long moment. The air conditioner hummed. Ice shifted in a water pitcher on the side table. Finally, William spoke, and his voice was different now. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something he had not wanted to see. Gentlemen, William said, looking at his fellow Australian officers, I think we need to acknowledge that our accounts may have become overstated. He turned to Nixon. Mr. President, you have made your point with precision. Nixon did not gloat. His face remained serious. No one disputes Australia's courage, but courage does not change the mathematics of war. He began gathering his documents back into neat piles. I am not asking you to diminish your veterans. I am asking you to describe their actual accomplishments without exaggeration. They did enough real things to be proud of. They do not need invented glories. Admiral McCain closed his notebook and put it back in his briefcase. Australia stood with us when we needed friends, he said. Your coast watchers saved American pilots. Your hospitals treated our wounded. Your ports gave our ships safe harbor. None of that changes just because you were not the main fighting force. Being a good ally is enough. It has always been enough. Patterson nodded slowly. He looked at Williams and the other officer. I think, he said carefully, that when we return home, we need to have some conversations with our military historians. Williams sighed deeply. Agreed, he said. Uncomfortable conversations, but necessary ones. Nixon stood up and everyone else rose with him. He walked around the table and extended his hand to Williams. The Australian hesitated for just a second, then took it. They shook hands firmly. Thank you for listening, Nixon said. I know this was not easy to hear. No, Williams admitted. It was not, but perhaps it needed to be said. He managed a small, tired smile. Better to hear it from friends than to have history prove us wrong later. They filed out of the conference room into the bright Hawaiian sunshine. The palm trees swayed in the warm breeze. In the distance, the ocean sparkled blue and endless, the same ocean where so many men from both countries had fought and died a generation before. The Australian generals climbed into a waiting car. As they drove away, Admiral McCain stood next to Nixon, watching them go. That was brutal, McCain said quietly. It was necessary, Nixon replied. Think they will actually change anything back home? Nixon shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe they will go back and ignore everything I said. But at least now, if Australia keeps claiming credit for American victories, they know that we know the truth. That matters. They walked back toward the building together. Nixon had other meetings scheduled, other items on his agenda for running a country and fighting a war in Vietnam. But this meeting, this confrontation over history and memory, would stick with him for years to come, because it had been about something more than just setting the record straight. It had been about respect, real respect, the kind that comes from honest words, not comfortable lies. The years rolled forward like waves across that blue Pacific. The uncomfortable meeting in Hawaii in May 1969 did not make headlines. No reporters were present. No photographs captured the moment when Nixon laid out his documents and challenged the Australian generals to face the truth. But the ripples from that meeting spread outward in ways that would take years to fully appear. By 1972, something had started to change in Australian military publications. New editions of textbooks began appearing with slightly different language, where earlier books had used phrases like equal partners and shared leadership. The new versions said things like significant contribution and important support role. It was subtle, but it was there. The shift had begun. In 1974, the Australian War Memorial in Canberra opened a new Pacific Theatre exhibition. The curators had worked for months on the displays, arguing over every word on every placard. When the exhibition finally opened, it showed Australian soldiers in combat, Australian nurses tending to wounded, and Australian coast watchers radioing positions of Japanese ships. But it also showed something else. It showed the scale. Maps displayed how many troops each nation had committed to different battles. Charts showed casualty figures side by side. For the first time, an official Australian institution was presenting the Pacific War in a way that matched the documentary evidence rather than national pride. Some Australian veterans were angry. They felt betrayed. They had fought hard and sacrificed much, and now it seemed like their country was diminishing their achievements. Letters to newspapers complained about American influence corrupting Australian history. But other veterans, especially those who had actually served alongside Americans in the Pacific, wrote different letters. They said it was about time someone told the truth. They said real honor came from honesty, not exaggeration. By 1976, Australian military staff colleges had revised their curriculum. Instructors now taught the Pacific War with more precise numbers and clearer attribution of which forces had done what. Officers like General Patterson, who had been in that meeting with Nixon, helped push for these changes. They had seen the evidence. They could not unsee it. The transformation was not complete or universal. In Australian popular culture, movies and television shows continued to emphasize Australian heroics, often with little mention of the larger American effort. Old myths die hard, especially when they are wrapped in national identity. But in official histories and academic studies, a more accurate accounting had taken hold. By 1980, when scholars wrote about the Pacific War, they acknowledged what the numbers had always shown. The United States had been the dominant force. Australia had been a valuable but junior partner. Nixon himself rarely spoke about that meeting in Hawaii. In his years after leaving the presidency in disgrace over Watergate, he wrote several books about history and foreign policy. In one interview, in 1985, a reporter asked him about his relationship with Australia during his presidency. Nixon paused, remembering. "I respected the Australians too much to lie to them about history," he said. "Some people think diplomacy means telling everyone what they want to hear, but real allies can handle the truth. They have to be able to handle it, or the friendship is not built on anything solid." The reporter followed up, asking if the conversation had damaged the alliance. Nixon shook his head. "Just the opposite," he said. "Once we cleared the air, we could work together more effectively. They knew where they stood. We knew where they stood. There was no more dancing around the truth, trying not to hurt feelings. We could be honest about capabilities, about contributions, about what each side could realistically provide. That made us stronger partners, not weaker ones." Admiral McCain, who lived until 1981, occasionally mentioned that meeting when talking to fellow veterans. He would tell the story of Nixon pulling out document after document, patiently dismantling inflated claims with nothing but facts. He did not yell, McCain would say. He did not insult anyone. He just showed them the numbers. And numbers are hard to argue with when they come from your own combat reports. The broader lessons from that meeting in Hawaii went beyond just Australian-American relations. In the decades that followed, military historians and political scientists would study the case as an example of how allied relationships can become strained by divergent historical narratives. When countries fight together in a war, they naturally want to emphasize their own contributions. Every nation looks at the struggle through its own lens, highlighting its own sacrifices. That is human nature. But when that natural pride crosses the line into rewriting history, problems emerge. The pattern has repeated in other conflicts. After the First Gulf War in 1991, disputes arose about which coalition members had contributed most to victory. After the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s, arguments broke out over burden sharing and credit for various operations. In each case, the same tension appeared. Smaller allies wanted recognition that sometimes exceeded their actual contribution. Larger allies wanted acknowledgement of having provided the bulk of forces and resources. What Nixon understood in 1969 and what remains true today is that these disputes cannot be solved by politeness alone. Being nice, nodding along, and letting false claims go unchallenged might avoid short-term confrontation, but it stores up long-term resentment. American veterans who knew they had carried the main burden in the Pacific resented seeing Australians claim equal credit. Australian officials who had been allowed to make inflated claims for years resented being suddenly corrected. The confrontation was painful, but avoiding it would have been worse. The principle extends beyond military history. In science, in business, in any field where people work together toward common goals, there is always a temptation to massage the truth to make everyone feel good. Team projects get described as collaborative efforts even when one person did most of the work. Companies announce partnerships as equal ventures even when one side contributed far more resources. Political coalitions claim shared credit for policies that one faction mainly created. Sometimes this is harmless. A little generosity in sharing credit can build goodwill and strengthen relationships. But there is a line. When the gap between claim and reality becomes too wide, when the distortion becomes too great, someone needs to say something. Someone needs to pull out the numbers, the documents, the evidence, and say, actually, this is what happened. Nixon's meeting with the Australian generals showed what that looks like done well. He did not seek to humiliate anyone. He brought evidence, not insults. He acknowledged genuine contributions while correcting exaggerations. He separated respect for individual courage from accuracy about overall force contributions. Most importantly, he insisted that honest friendship required honest history. The alternative, the path of least resistance, would have been to smile and let the inflated claims continue. Many presidents might have made that choice. It would have avoided an awkward confrontation. It would have kept everyone happy in the moment. But it would have been a betrayal of truth and a disservice to the American veterans whose actual sacrifices would have been diminished by false equivalence. Today, the Pacific War is understood more accurately, at least in official histories and academic studies. The numbers are clear. The United States provided the overwhelming majority of forces, suffered the great majority of casualties, and led the great majority of operations that defeated Japan. Australia fought bravely and provided valuable support, particularly in New Guinea and later in Borneo. Both statements are true. Both can coexist. Australian veterans can be honoured for what they actually did without needing to inflate their role to something it was not. The meeting in that Hawaiian conference room teaches us something essential about human relationships, whether between individuals, organizations, or nations. Truth is the foundation. Without it, everything else is built on sand. Respect without honesty is flattery. Partnership without accuracy is pretense. Alliance without truth is fragile. Nixon's willingness to have that difficult conversation, to lay out the evidence calmly and insist on accuracy, even at the risk of offense, showed a kind of courage, different from battlefield valor, but no less important. It is the courage to say uncomfortable things when they need to be said. The courage to correct errors even when correction is unwelcome. The courage to believe that real friends can handle hard truths. And that handling those truths together makes the friendship stronger, not weaker. The Pacific War was won by American blood, treasure, and industrial might with brave Australian support. Both parts of that sentence matter. Neither part should be erased. And sometimes the most important thing a leader can say is simply this: let us look at the numbers. Let us face what actually happened. Let us honor the real achievements without inventing false ones. Let us build our alliance on truth, because anything else is not worth building. That is what Nixon understood in Hawaii in 1969. That is what the Australian generals eventually accepted. And that is the lesson that echoes forward across the decades, reminding us that the deepest respect we can show to anyone, ally or adversary, friend or stranger, is to tell them the truth.